The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Another one bites the dust. Rand Paul, the so-called libertarian in the Republican primary field, is ending his campaign. They never just say, Lewis, I'm ending the campaign. They say they are suspending the campaign. Well, it is indeed going to be suspended today. There is no indication whatsoever that Rand Paul had any chance of winning the Republican primary, which in a way is sad because I think that both Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders would be better options than Rand Paul. But within the Republican field, Rand Paul on many issues was by far the most reasonable guy, Lewis. I mean, I'm no isolationist, but his foreign policy made a lot more sense than the carpet-bombing neoconservatism of someone like Ted Cruz, for example. Yes, on energy and on the environment and on abortion, oftentimes Rand Paul didn't make a lot of sense. But from the guys on the stage, he and Kasich were the reasonable guys. And unfortunately, in 2016, being reasonable doesn't really help you with Republican voters.
No, you have to be either very religious or very xenophobic, I guess, or those are your two options, or both.
And he did not do well in Iowa at all. And there was every indication he was going to do even worse in New Hampshire, which in a sense is weird, Lewis, because New Hampshire on the Republican side in general, but particularly on the Republican side, is more sort of libertarian-minded. You would think Rand Paul is their guy, although on many issues he's not really a libertarian, but he's at least presented as one, did not appear as though he was going to do any better in New Hampshire. And he is saying, that is it for me. And he's actually in the middle of a re-election, or he needs to get going with his re-election campaign to the Senate in Kentucky. Mayor Jim Gray of Lexington, Kentucky, has filed to run against Rand Paul towards the end of last month. I mean, in the last 10 days. Maybe Paul is just realizing I've gotten the publicity I can get from being on that Republican debate stage, but I'm not going to win, and I need to make sure I can even stay in the Senate. Probably a pragmatic move by Rand Paul.
And it wouldn't surprise me if that was the plan all along. Maybe he realized that he was not going to become president.
It doesn't seem crazy to me for him to have said, okay, I'm not going to do well, but if I can at least poll well enough to participate in debates, more people will be aware of me. I will probably be able to raise more money in my Senate re-election campaign, and then I'll just bail and say I'm suspending my campaign. Yeah, no doubt about it. Could have been a plan all along. And indeed, we say goodbye to Rand Paul. I actually was aware that Rand Paul was running a campaign. I mean, Rick Santorum and Jeb Bush, there were other people, Chris Christie, who are making even less of an impact, and they're still in for now. I mean, they should maybe take a guide here from Rand Paul and do the same.
I think anyone who is on stage two really should definitely take the hint at this point. And probably, unfortunately, Kasich and Christie, yes.
You want to see some serious mental illness? I mean, real religious delusions. I present to you a clip of Republican presidential candidate Ted Cruz's father, Rafael Cruz, on a religious program called Focus Today on The Dove TV. Rafael Cruz explained this completely bizarre story of how before Ted Cruz declared he was going to run for president, he and his family, and Rafael as well, they all spent 6 months in prayer trying to figure out whether Ted Cruz should try to become the president. And ultimately, it was something that God or the Holy Spirit communicated to Ted Cruz's wife, Heidi Cruz, that convinced Ted Cruz that God indeed wants him to run for president. Let's take a look at the video. This is very disturbing stuff. I mean, if there are children in the room, I really would not let the kids watch this because this stuff will rot your brain, okay? As adults, hopefully we're prepared to handle it. Let's take a look.
I would assume, you correct me, that you and your family, and especially Ted, have been called to run for president. How do you pray for him?
Well, I'll tell you, the decision to run for president of Ted was a long decision. Ted and his wife and family, they spent 6 months in prayer.
Right.
Just seeking the will of God as to what to do. And that culminated one time that the whole family was together. And even his senior staff, we were attending a church service all together at First Baptist Church of Houston, where he's a member. And after church, we went up to the pastor's office. We spent 2 hours on our knees seeking God's will about this decision.
Go on.
And it was there where Heidi said a word that, I believe it was just inspiration from God. And she said, seek God's face, not God's hand. And that was just as if there was a presence of the Holy Spirit in the room. And that, we all were at awe. And Ted, just all that it came out of his mouth, he said, here am I, Lord.
Right. This is what happened, Lewis, when God told Heidi Cruz to seek God's face instead of God's hand. Imagine what we would be dealing with today if God had told Heidi Cruz to go seek God's groin. I mean, things really could have gotten ugly.
I think I don't really know what happens that people think the Lord has communicated with them.
Yeah.
I mean, it really could be anything, right?
Sure.
A dove could fly by the window, a book could fall off a shelf, and they think, this is God speaking to me.
Yeah. Ted Cruz is not just dangerous. He is not just an extremist conservative whose ideas bear no connection to the real world. Ted Cruz's family, including in particular his father, Rafael Cruz, they've convinced themselves and apparently Ted Cruz that Cruz has somehow been anointed by God to bring about the return of Jesus or of Jesus, a Jesus-like period to the world or the United States. If you thought it was bad when George W. Bush prayed and God told him to go into Iraq, right? If you're still reeling from the consequences of what George W. Bush thought God told him, just wait until you have a president who thinks his entire candidacy and presidency were planned specifically by God to bring about the second coming of Christ. That is going to be ugly, Lewis. You can't even imagine the likes of that.
Quite ugly. And if he loses, I can't wait to hear the explanation.
We did a story on January 12th telling you that Ted Cruz's immigration ad was way crazier than Donald Trump's immigration ad. We did a story on December 29th telling you that Ted Cruz's supporters rival Donald Trump supporters in lunacy. We did a story on September 16th telling you that in the early Republican debate, I think it was the second debate, Ted Cruz stood out as particularly disturbing in rhetoric and ideas. And yesterday, after he won the Iowa caucus, I told you that the guy is a real danger to society. I mean, truly incompetent. I want to expand on that just a bit to remind you about how outrageous Ted Cruz is. Let's put up the list. And some of these items I mentioned yesterday, and I want to expand the list. Ted Cruz, as I mentioned earlier today, believes that he was anointed by God to be the president. Okay, that alone should be enough to strike fear into all of our hearts and minds about Ted Cruz. He believes God anointed him. Okay, disaster. Ted Cruz tried blaming those Planned Parenthood murders on a transgender liberal activist. Of course, no evidence whatsoever supporting that. Ted Cruz spoke at a rally where gays were deemed satanic, as if it was a normal rally to participate in. Ted Cruz claimed that President Obama is pushing Syrian refugees to murder innocent Americans. Absolutely no evidence of that, obviously. Ted Cruz said that the U.S. must be turned into a Christian theocracy in order to save the country. He has advocated for ignoring the Supreme Court after they made a decision outlawing bans on same-sex marriage. Ted Cruz boasted about the greatness of renowned racist former Senator Jesse Helms. He is staunchly anti-abortion and works to make it harder to access safe abortions. He wants no path to citizenship for the 11 million undocumented immigrants that are in this country. He wants to carpet bomb Iraq and Syria without doing any damage to innocent civilians, which is, of course, impossible. He wants to repeal the Affordable Care Act with absolutely no plan to replace it. He is one of the worst climate deniers in the Senate today, and he happens to have an A-plus rating from the NRA on gun safety. And as we know, Lewis, if the NRA really likes what you're doing, you're probably doing something very, very wrong. This is an incredibly dangerous candidate. And I know Trump is bad, right? But the entire Trump thing is increasingly a joke. I've said it for months. Donald Trump is not going to be the nominee. Put it out of your minds. It's really a question of Cruz versus Rubio. Cruz is far more nuts than Rubio, but I also think he has less of a chance of winning. But you never know. 2 weeks before the election, there's some kind of attack. We know who benefits from these attacks. It's the neocons. I think it is dangerous that Ted Cruz be up there, even though I believe Marco Rubio has a better chance of winning, because if, God forbid, to borrow a term from Ted Cruz were to be the next president of the United States, we are in serious, serious trouble.
Well, maybe. He is pretty nuts. There's only so far you can go with executive action. But
he will likely have the Congress.
Right. So if it's a Republican-controlled Congress, we're doomed. Yes.
Absolutely. So I think that we all need to be very, very concerned about this. Very, very often, Mitt Romney, for example, right? Mitt Romney would have been a bad president. Mitt Romney made all sorts of ridiculous claims. He said if he's president, every college graduate will have a job. He said if he's able to repeal the Affordable Care Act, he should be able to get unemployment down to 6% by January of 2017. Totally ridiculous, right? President Obama did that in far less time without repealing the Affordable Care Act. Would have been a bad president. But Mitt Romney didn't strike me as completely out of his mind in a way that instills fear into me the way that Ted Cruz does. I mean, I think we're talking about two totally different... I'm not cheerleading Mitt Romney, right? I mean, it's crazy that I have to sort of say Mitt Romney wasn't really even that bad compared to Ted Cruz. That is how bad the situation is with Cruz.
Well, when someone has radical ideas, and then when someone else has radical ideas that are rooted in religion, I think it's that kind of scares you a bit more, right?
No doubt about it. I mean, when Ted Cruz says he wants a Christian theocracy, he's effectively saying that in many ways. The similarities with the Muslim extremists he claims to be fighting against become very, very clear. We've talked about that as far as LGBT rights goes. We've talked about that as far as the law of a sacred text, pick whichever one you want, being the law of the land. That is a similarity between these extremist right-wing Christians and the extremist Muslims that we are fighting against in Iraq and Syria, etc. The similarities become very, very clear. It is one brand of religious extremism fighting against another brand of religious extremism and falling into the very false notion, Lewis, that this particular brand of religious-based extremism is somehow good for us, but other types would be bad. That's a big, big mistake.
Yeah, it's unfortunate that we can't really point to a country in the world that is as dominated by Christianity as, say, Saudi Arabia is dominated by Islam. I think that we would be able to draw some great parallels if there was such a place that we could point to. I guess there's only the Vatican. We know the type of things that are happening there.
Yes, although totally different circumstances, scale is different.
Yeah.
I mean, everything about it. Yeah, you're right. There is no particularly good example to sort of show, hey, this is what a Christian version of Saudi Arabia, or pick whichever country you want, looks like. Very, very scary stuff. Send me your thoughts on this. I'm on Twitter at dpackman, and Lewis is on Twitter at LewisMotamedi. That's LouisMotamedi.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Our program is different than other political shows you might watch or listen to. We're not funded by big corporate media conglomerates. We are not funded by big corporations. We mostly are funded by viewers like you. Today's new member of the day is Richard Colonna. Richard, thank you so much for being a David Pakman Show member. You can join Richard at davidpakman.com/membership. We are talking about mere pennies a day. And because of the support of those pennies, which can add up to dollars over the course of several months, we are now broadcasting 5 days a week. The program is bigger than ever. We had our best December ever in 2015. I'm sorry, we had our best month ever in December of 2015. I'm still tallying the numbers from January in terms of podcast downloads and YouTube views, but I think January 2016 is again the best month ever for the David Pakman Show, and we will only continue to grow with support from viewers like you. So please go to davidpakman.com/membership, sign up, and remember, if you ever shop on Amazon, davidpakman.com/Amazon. Okay, I want to get to Hatriot Mail today. We've been talking about if Bernie Sanders goes the distance, inevitably, the anti-Semitism is going to surface. And merely as a sort of preview, Lewis, I have two examples today of Hatriot Mail. These are anti-Semitic tirades directed at me, but imagine that these would exist 100, 1,000 times over if Bernie Sanders were to be the nominee. Let's go first to tell you what Hatriot Mail even is.
It's like email forwards from your racist grandma on steroids. Hatriot Mail. Written by patriots who hate David Pakman. Because America. And because freedom.
All right, example number one of what to expect, the type of thing to expect if Bernie Sanders goes the distance. Let's take a listen together.
Nasty little Jew dunk. All your BS is Jew propaganda. Jew filth garbage. Shut the f*** up. Do you work for the Ashkenazi Jew Rothschild rapists of mankind? George Soros, your butt buddy?
I have never met George Soros, Lewis, and I don't believe you have either.
Gorge. No. Curious Gorge.
Yes, Curious Gorge, the curious case of Curious Gorge. Okay, and then another example. Again, the type of thing we would all have to become much more familiar with if Bernie Sanders is indeed the nominee. Let's take a listen.
It is obvious that you are a Jew, and I love what they came up with for names when they came to the USA, as I have a friend with the last name Needleman, whose family sells clothes. So, what does a Pakman do?
Brilliant question, Lewis. I mean, really incisive analysis. And we're going to talk later today about Bernie Sanders requesting and reportedly receiving Secret Service protection for the duration of the campaign. I've said it before and I'll say it again. This is going to be an issue. We're already seeing it in the white supremacist enclaves of the internet, and it's just a reality. And Bernie Sanders, in my mind, is the progressive candidate. Has no impact on that whatsoever. But these are realities he's going to have to deal with.
I think so. And it's amazing that it really hasn't come up in discussion at all. I mean, he's not a very religious guy, it seems.
Of course not.
That has, I think, something to do with it.
We haven't talked much about the story of 16-year-old African-American girl, Gynnya McMillen, who was taken into custody by police after an altercation where she was allegedly the perpetrator in a misdemeanor assault against a victim with what police described as minor injuries. Some said that Ms. McMillen was involved in a domestic dispute. Police showed up, they took her into custody, and locked her up in a Kentucky juvenile detention center in January. Not 24 hours later, after being locked up for about 14 or so hours, she was found dead in a cell in that juvenile detention center. She was discovered in what's described as a sleeping position in a supposedly secure room at Lincoln Village Regional Juvenile Detention Center. The official story is she died in her sleep. Odd story, unusual story, not the easiest story to believe. This is the first such incident in 16 years in Kentucky. A preliminary autopsy showed, quote, no cause or manner of death, according to a statement released by authorities. There were no obvious signs of trauma. There was no drug overdose, and toxicology was going to take several weeks to get the results from. Lincoln Village policy, and this is where things start to get a little murky, requires observation checks be made on residents every 15 minutes. Okay, so every 15 minutes, juveniles in the center are supposed to be checked on. And in addition, they aren't even supposed to be left unattended in a room unless that room has a camera in it. Unclear whether the policy was followed in this case. A couple of more weeks have gone by since the incident happened. What else have we learned? Many interesting things. Number one, we've learned that Reginald Wyndham, a 10-year employee with the center, has been put on paid administrative leave for a little bit of a tongue twister there, Lewis. Put on paid administrative leave for failing to check on her every 15 minutes as required. So that, number one, Lewis, is already a question. If indeed this was just a random thing that happened, why does it also coincide, correlation, not causation, that she happened not to be checked on every 15 minutes, or at least that is what we are led to believe. That's sort of number one that starts making this a little bit unusual. We've also learned that Gynnya had been previously removed from her mother's custody and placed at Home for Innocents, which is a home for sort of a foster care facility for kids that are either abandoned or neglected or abused. And we've also learned that once in custody, Gynnya was not violent, but reportedly refused to take off a hoodie during a pat-down search. And according to the Kentucky Center for Investigative Reporting, officers took her down using an Aikido restraint move. Hypothetically, as some are speculating, maybe something in that story is not exactly true. Maybe she was taken down in a way that did somehow hurt her, in a way that hours later ended up with her dead, reportedly in a sleeping position in her cell. A number of questions, Lewis, around the story.
I mean, but presumably the autopsy would have shown that, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no. So that is the other unusual thing somewhere we have to be getting some unusual, some incorrect information, right? Because on the one hand, there was no cause shown in terms of like a pre-existing condition by the autopsy. So the idea that she would just randomly die in her sleep while in this cell, hard to really believe. At the same time, the autopsy did not show any kind of trauma that would have caused the death. So something here is very much missing.
Now, what I would do is if I were a family member, I would have the body sent to an entirely different county, maybe in a different state, and have a different autopsy done.
If you had the money.
If I had the money, because I think that, well, we're trusting that's what's happening here. And if this is the mortician or whatever, the pathologist who works
Not the mortician,
pathologist who works with the police department all the time, sometimes there are some connections there, and sometimes things can...
Yeah, I get what you're saying. I mean, people are starting to get very conspiratorial here, right? Understandably, because something is just not adding up.
I don't like the word conspiracy. I think someone somewhere is lying, but would you call that a conspiracy?
Well, I guess it would be, in the legal sense, it may be conspiracy to cover up what took place, right? Yeah, so in that sense, it could be a conspiracy. Very, very unusual and disturbing story, and we'll continue covering it and hopefully have something definitive at some point, although it obviously will not bring this 16-year-old back who died in police custody. Just absolutely horrible. I have video of CNN and Jake Tapper visibly perplexed by Sarah Palin's explanation of why she supports Donald Trump in spite of the fact that he was very, very pro-choice at one point and now claims to be pro-life. Trump was against abortion. Trump was for abortion. Now he claims to be against it. It's all sort of a joke, right? I mean, this entire Trump candidacy is a total bogus joke. But I read that Sarah Palin went on TV and tried to explain that change in position. And when I heard Sarah Palin tried to explain a change of opinion, I said, I absolutely have to see this. And she did not disappoint. She invoked none other than Justin Bieber. And she generally just baffled Jake Tapper. I mean, look, if you're watching along with me, take a look at the expression on Jake Tapper's face, visibly confused by this explanation from Sarah Palin.
You talked about inconsistencies among the votes and the positions of Senator Cruz. Donald Trump is somebody who has clearly had different positions on issues that he has today, including an issue very near and dear to your heart, the issue of abortion and life. Have you talked to him about that? He called himself very pro-choice. Now he says he's very pro-life. Have you talked about it?
I am so glad that Mr. Trump has seen the light and understands the sanctity of innocent life and how a baby in the womb should be most protected. What has been kind of sad about the situation, though, politically speaking, are groups that are pro-life and they say they want to bring more people into the fold. They given Trump a hard time for his past views on abortion, where they're celebrating others, like I was going through a list, like Justin Bieber and
Justin Bieber.
Who has made statements understanding the sanctity of life, but in the past said he was no big deal to him. He's just one example. But I've heard that these same groups celebrate people who have, I've been to their fundraisers, I've spoken at their events, and there's usually someone in the crowd, every single one of these crowds, who will testify to having seen the light, you know, to understand, oh, I get it, that God has created life with purpose. And
so you believe Mr. Trump when he says he's...
And then to see that they're celebrated, but for political reason, Mr. Trump is condemned for changing his views to the right side. Yeah, that's politics.
Yeah, Justin Bieber was also pro-choice, Lewis, but is now pro-life. So, hey, I support Trump. I mean, the logic of that is not really striking me as good. I guess the logic is she knows other abortion flip-floppers also. One was a 16-year-old kid at the time, but still, Trump's great.
It doesn't really make sense that people who are very, very adamantly pro-life would condemn Donald Trump.
Right.
And at the same time praise someone like Justin Bieber. They would be praising Donald Trump if he changed his mind on this issue because they're pro-life and they want everyone to be pro-life.
Right.
So I don't understand her argument. I don't think that makes sense. But to me, it's clear that it is a flip-flop. I mean, Donald Trump is pandering to his base.
I would bet money that Donald Trump is pro-choice still. I don't think there's any question about it. Now, just as a point of interest, Sarah Palin is referring to when Rolling Stone asked a then 16-year-old Justin Bieber about abortion in cases of rape. I mean, why are you even asking a 16-year-old kid about abortion in cases of rape? And Justin Bieber said, well, I think that's really sad, but everything happens for a reason. And then he went on to say, I don't know how that would be a reason. I guess I haven't been in that position, so I wouldn't be able to judge that. So Justin Bieber basically answered, listen, I'm 16 years old. I don't have a clue what the hell is going on here. And Sarah Palin is saying, hey, this 69-year-old politician and lifelong businessman, his change of position on something as important as abortion is sort of the same as when a 16-year-old kid was sandbagged by Rolling Stone into commenting on abortion. It's equivalent in some way. I mean, this woman is living on another planet.
Well, we knew that.
Yeah.
How many years ago?
8, I guess, at this point. Yeah, no, it's been a while. Bizarre. And Jake Tapper, he just looks confused. Like he doesn't know what she's talking about and absolutely dumbfounded by her mention of Justin Bieber. But now this is what we call politics in America, at least on the Republican side. The David Pakman Show is on Facebook at facebook.com/David Pakman Show. And we are also on Reddit at davidpakman.com/REDDIT.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's great to be joined today by Peter Frase, who's an editor at Jacobin Magazine and author of the forthcoming book, For Futures, from Verso Press. This is such an interesting topic, Peter. You know, we've been talking about the possibilities of post-workism, the post-work society, including as a result of automation and technological unemployment. Let's sort of go backwards first, if we can. Set up for us, when did we sort of begin the status quo that many of us know today of sort of wage labor and working full-time as we know it, as the de facto way to sort of make a living or to live one's life? How old is that paradigm?
Well, it varies, of course, in different places. I think certainly in the rich countries, we sort of trace it back to the Industrial Revolution and the 19th century, and then the 20th century kind of generalized it across more and more of the population that, you know, you didn't have any other way to make a living. People weren't, you know, living their own sort of growing their own food or living independently. You had to go out and get a job in order to earn money, in order to buy the goods that were required, in order to pay your rent, all of that sort of thing. You know, over the years throughout the 20th century, more and more people were sort of drawn into that way of living until now it's sort of considered the only way. And for most people, it is the only way that it's possible to live.
And let's talk a little bit about first the sort of pros hypothetically of a post-work society. If we can imagine a situation where humans are sort of no longer in the situation where the default need is for them to be working full time, providing a service or manufacturing a product or whatever the case may be. What are the sort of positive possibilities that are presented in such a society? What opportunities are there that would be good as we might describe them?
Well, the basic idea is that time is sort of the ultimate form of wealth. It's the ultimate good, is to have time for ourselves to do what we want when we are neither working for someone else nor sort of desperately hustling for survival. And when you look at it, this is, on a material basis, the wealthiest human civilization that has ever existed. We have the ability to provide a decent standard of living for people without forcing them to spend most of their waking hours doing something that they might rather not be doing or working for someone else. And what people do with their time, it's an open question. It could be writing poetry, it could be growing vegetables, it could be raising children, it could be writing software. Ultimately, I think, at least where I come from, the idea here is that we have a society that is able to make truly free time available to people on a much wider basis than it currently is. And it's simply that our economic and political institutions don't allow that.
One of the big concerns whenever we talk about what may be a shifting paradigm with regard to work and post-workism is the idea that all of a sudden we will have increased poverty, we will have unemployment, people won't be able to get jobs because so many jobs will be done by machines. That sort of way of thinking seems to me rooted in a sort of attachment to the status quo of working full time in order to have a life or make a living. Is it going to be a challenge to first separate ourselves from that sort of reflexive idea if we are to pursue what seems to be coming increasingly in a productive way? Are people married to that idea so that they often can't even really consider what things would be like?
I don't know that it's necessarily that people can't consider it. I think it's people rightly fear that the potential benefits of the technologies that we have, of the social structure that we have, the potential benefits are not going to accrue to you if you are simply broke and unemployed. Right? It might, in principle, be possible to liberate people from work, but if what in practice happens is that a few people own the robots and get rich, and the rest of us are simply desperate, then that's not better than the old system of you just get a job and a wage and you survive. Right? I mean, these are anxieties that go back to the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, to the folk tale of John Henry, the steel driving man, who is a railroad worker who's has to race against the steam-powered hammer and beats the steam-powered hammer and then drops dead. That's the sort of, that kind of competition against the machine rather than the machine liberating us from labor is an anxiety that goes back a long ways, and it's rooted in a very sensible anxiety that we aren't, without a certain political struggle, we aren't going to get the potential benefits we could get.
Yeah, I mean, the ideas of a post-work society have been explored in science fiction for a long time. Childhood's End by Arthur C. Clarke rings a bell to me. I believe that was written in the early 1950s. You talk about in your upcoming book about this essay written by John Maynard Keynes, where he said that humans will have this question of how do we use our time when economic concerns may be resolved? What exactly do we do? I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about that.
Well, and in some ways, that's exactly right. Keynes, he wrote this essay called Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren back in the 30s. And that was a time in which people like him, mainstream economists, mainstream thinkers, sort of believed that we were going to all be working less and less, because at that time that had been the tendency. You had in the 19th century workers who had fought to get the 10-hour day. And then after that, they fought to get the 8-hour day. And we were talking in the 30s about the 35 or the 30-hour week. So this idea that we would have more and more time and that our future problem was going to be to figure out what to do with that time, that just seemed like common sense to someone like Keynes. And the thing is that what happened is that we didn't keep on that path. We got stuck at working 40, or for a lot of people more than 40 hours a week. And so what I would consider to be the better problem of what do we do with our free time never arose.
I'd be curious how, for example, the narrative that often exists now is, well, you've got to get a good job. And in order to do that, you have to go to college. And in order to get into college, you have to do well in high school. And in order to do well in high school, you should really build up your education and study habits in middle school and in elementary school. How would a post-work society change the entire path of education?
Well, I think it would in some ways be getting back to the idea that education is not narrowly focused on preparing you for a job. I think that's, recently that's become the sort of mantra, is that education is just, all it is just preparing you for a job, even though, people get out of college and in fact, even if you get an engineering degree, it turns out that there aren't enough jobs for the people with those degrees. That idea, that narrow idea of education as just preparing you for a job is a failure in practice. But the broader idea of education, of equipping you with the tools to live a rich life, meaning, the broader ideal of sort of liberal education, that education equips you to be able to appreciate life and to be able to go through society in a richer way, that is something that goes far beyond the idea of work. And I think we can go back to that and really have a deeper appreciation of the importance of education if we get away from this idea that it's just narrowly job training.
Is your sense that this transition to a sort of post-work society is inevitable?
I don't think it's inevitable. I think it is ultimately a political question. There are a lot of different ways we can go. My book goes into this idea that we have the material ability to liberate people from work. Whether we do depends on a political struggle. Right now, the wealth of society is concentrated in very few hands, and we could easily have a society in which we all continue to work jobs that don't really need to exist in order to enrich others. We could easily live in a society where a lot of us simply become superfluous and we become, marginal slum dwellers essentially because we don't have access to social wealth. Or we could live in a truly post-work society in which we are all able to enjoy free time, enjoy leisure time, and access the benefits that our society potentially can make available.
And what's your sense of the transitional period that would be in place? Is that going to be really the most complex period, the figuring out how to get from A to B?
Yes, I think so. And I think that's the period we are currently in. When you look at all of the struggles that we are currently seeing around, the conversations we're having about income inequality, about the future of work, about the 99% and the 1%, that's because we are in that transition right now, and we are trying to figure out how to navigate it.
I'll remind you that the forthcoming book is For Futures from Verso Press. We've been speaking with the book's author, Peter Frase, who's also an editor at Jacobin Magazine. Peter, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
We have some disturbing news about the Zika virus. News alleges that there has been a sexual transmission of the Zika virus. The first known case of transmission in the United States reported in Dallas, Texas yesterday by local health officials. And they're saying it was not contracted through a mosquito bite, but rather through sex. So as a reminder, let's take a look at what we previously knew, Lewis, about the Zika virus. It is related to dengue, yellow fever, Japanese encephalitis, and West Nile viruses. No vaccine to prevent infection, no real treatment for Zika. The typical symptoms are headache, rash, fever, and back pain, treated with rest. I'll remind you, 4 out of 5 who are infected often have no symptoms whatsoever. And really the issue is it is transmitted by mosquitoes, and that it impacts pregnant women, specifically in terms of the children that they are that they are pregnant with at the time of contagion or transmission. The children born with microcephaly and a number of other conditions that are very, very serious. So we previously believed, Lewis, transmission was only possible by mosquitoes, but we now have a report that the Zika virus has been sexually transmitted. And this does not change the seriousness in terms of the symptoms. 4 out of 5 people still don't have symptoms. It doesn't change the fact that most people do not, that it is not serious to individual adults who get it. But this certainly does change the vector dynamics if now this is not only transmitted by mosquitoes, but sexually. The reports are early, but there is no particular reason to discount the reports, that's for sure.
No, it's really not that surprising to me that this is transmittable in more ways than just a mosquito bite after hearing about it. And I think that I don't really know what to expect here. I don't know if this is going to be as bad as the media fear-mongering would make it seem. I think luckily for us, this is not nearly as dangerous as something like Ebola.
Absolutely.
So I don't think people need to freak out as much. I just think that if you are pregnant or are trying to become pregnant, if you are in an at-risk area, get tested for it.
And increasingly, most of the Americas are an at-risk area. WHO spokesman Gregory Hartle told Reuters, "We certainly understand the concern. This needs to be further investigated to understand the conditions and how often or likely sexual transmission is and whether or not other bodily fluids are implicated. The reality of the transmission, as Lewis mentioned, needs to be separated from fear-mongering around the seriousness of Zika. Very serious for children who are in the gestation period at the time of the mother's infection, but beyond that, not particularly dangerous so far, that we know for sure." There hasn't been much reporting about this with all the news from the Iowa caucuses and the upcoming debates and next week's New Hampshire primary, but Bernie Sanders' campaign requested Secret Service protection for him a couple of days ago. The request was initially being reviewed by everybody from House Speaker Paul Ryan, House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi, Senate leadership, others in the Department of Homeland Security, etc. And shortly after that report was filed, Ed Henry from Fox News said that Bernie Sanders is indeed getting Secret Service protection. So the question some people had was why? Now, some people said, why only now? He should have had it a long time ago. And others saying, why now? We should wait before giving him Secret Service protection. Bernie Sanders is drawing some of the biggest crowds of the presidential election cycle, crowds of 20,000 in Minnesota just in the last week. He's been using a sort of private security detail that has been going with him to some of his stops, but I think it absolutely makes sense at this point, particularly given the size of these crowds and the fact that, hey, remember, he essentially tied Hillary Clinton in Iowa. Hillary Clinton, of course, having Secret Service protection as a former first lady in part, but not only because of that, I think it absolutely corresponds that Bernie Sanders should have Secret Service protection. Now, I did get a couple of emails from viewers, Lewis, saying, isn't this drawing more attention to Bernie Sanders, maybe negative attention? Somebody who might want to harm him sees that, oh, now he's being protected. Now I really want to harm him. I think the Secret Service, generally speaking, does a very, very good job. And if a couple of people get inspired to think about trying to get to Bernie Sanders as a result of him having protection, I think that is far outweighed by the benefits of him being properly protected at these events.
And I think most people won't even hear about this story. So
yeah,
I agree with you there. And I think it's pretty standard procedure. So I don't see what the big deal is.
And people have been emailing me also saying, David, Bernie Sanders is one of the toughest candidates on big corporations. I mean, his policies are a threat to big corporations. So he has to worry about corporate hitmen. Listen, I know I've said this before. Bernie Sanders has to worry also because he's Jewish and people hate Jews. And we have seen, because of the Donald Trump joke candidacy, one of the biggest resurgences in the white supremacist movement, which hates black people and hates Jews, or I guess they say they don't hate them. They just want us all to live separately and remove any political or economic clout that black people and Jewish people and whoever else has. I think that there are any number of security concerns for a democratic socialist Jew in the United States coinciding with white supremacist forums online like Stormfront having to upgrade their servers because they're getting so much traffic.
Yeah, I think that it is probably more likely that some right-wing lunatic would want to hurt Bernie Sanders, but I don't think...
a corporate hitman.
Yes, but I don't think worrying about a corporate hitman is completely unreasonable either.
Really?
Yeah, that's true.
Talk about that a little bit.
I think that that's clear. Bernie is for financial reform in a big way. Bernie is going to mean a loss of profit or lower profits for many of these businesses. Maybe they see him as a threat. And when billions and billions, maybe even trillions of dollars are on the line, what's paying a few million to a jackal?
Lewis is going dark here. So who would you imagine that in a big company would say, like, would the CEO personally get together with someone and say, listen, we got to knock off this Bernie Sanders guy? Or do you think that it would sort of be done in a more underground way to maintain sort of plausible deniability for the executives? How would it, talk to me about the logistics?
It probably starts with maybe one person close to the top. And that person is probably leaving almost everyone else out of it.
Right.
I don't envision like a boardroom meeting where everyone says, yeah, maybe it's time to take Bernie out.
All right.
Not
What
really
do you think? What do you think about Lewis's little hypothesis here? It is quite interesting. No doubt about that. We have a voicemail number. The number is 219-2-David P. Call any time of day. Here's a voicemail I received.
Mr. David Packman, want to wish you a belated happy birthday. And also make my annual comment that as you're 32, you are liberal. But when you hit 62, and if you still are on the air, maybe syndicated show, you will be as right-wing and extreme as Rush Limbaugh, Sean Hannity, Glenn Beck, Bill O'Reilly, and Eric Erickson.
All right. That is Troy York, of course. Number one, the show is already syndicated. We're on 200 stations across the country. The myth that people get more conservative as they get older is exactly that. It is a myth. At any given time, the older generations are more conservative than the younger generations, but there is no evidence that individuals, by and large, get more conservative as they age. And in fact, Lewis, I think I'm more progressive than ever at this point.
Yeah, the evidence suggests that you grow more, your beliefs as you get older grow stronger.
Exactly.
Of course, there are exceptions. Some people do change.
Sure, no question about it. On today's bonus show, a picture of a potato sells for $1 million. We will tell you, was it a russet potato or was it a purple potato? I don't actually know the answer. I'm sure Lewis does. Memphis Meats unveils a test tube meatball, and this actually connects to a much broader issue that I've been reading about lately. And President Obama requests over $1 billion for heroin addiction. No, not for his habit, as some lunatics have suggested based on the headline, but to treat and deal with the heroin addiction epidemic. DavidPackman.com/membership is how you sign up to be a member. You get instant access to the bonus show and so many other great things. We will speak to you then. Hell of a bonus show today, Lewis. Thank you.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.